Hi everyone, this is BB Miniatures or Brennan Baker with my revival of the White Scars painting tutorial. Now, if you're familiar with my work, you may know that I have a personal passion for the 5th Legion Space Marines, particularly during the setting of the Horus Heresy. I've brought forth many iterations of the scheme from my initial concepts of the sunrise, where I had this vision of painting a sunrise source light coming from the back left of the miniature. I've painted a couple of bikes in this fashion, along with a silver bullet themed one that I managed to place third in from an online painting competition held by Cult of Paint during COVID. As excited as it was to paint with a myriad of challenges and a lot that has taught me, painting in this style, sadly to the degree of detail for an entire army, would be a ridiculous task, especially since I started my commission painting and early teaching at the time. Just the bandwidth just wasn't available to me. Fast forward, a new idea came to fruition in form of a question, and that was, what is it that makes white painting interesting? You simply can't paint white with it pure and expecting to be in your midtone and to get something of a higher value for highlights like you would with any other paint theme. From there, it was the idea that white gets easily corrupted from other colors and bounce lights from other colored sources. Affecting temperature would also come into play and form a part of the answer to that as well. There are many themes that feature some color in the white, and that being the most popular was the blue creating a form of a cool white, or others that stick to more of a black, white, gray approach, which I honestly found just kind of boring, or rather, not in the way that I wanted to express the Legion. Green would be my choice, as it's something I haven't seen before, and would complement the red marking well. And on a side note, I generally always like to do things a little bit different and much rather travel on the path least explored. The strong theme that started to occur in my theme was acting more as like a strong OSL coming from below, and would see a lot more of my work with the white scars in this manner. From a couple of units of jet bikes to the new plastic Mark 6s, and most notably Chinza and his Keshig that I painted for a wonderful client. Time goes by, my skills get pushed further, continuing to learn, and with that, my tastes also change too. Painting those, I was at a stage in my creative expression using palettes of high vibrancy and saturation, explosive colors, and I definitely loved it. Now, though, I wanted to flex my skills to paint more restrained and exercise a more tonal approach to painting. Coming back to the white scars theme, I felt the green was still at home in the theme, but trying to find a more balanced and less saturated take to make the white feel more natural, the lighting a little more softer. This also coincides with getting in touch with Mike from Radio Free Isstvan, bringing me on the show and kindly giving me his time to talk about my painting, the Horus Heresy, and help promote my painting tutorials hosted on my website, The Pro Palette. All this coming from his kindness and the love of the hobby, and in return, I said I would be happy to make a Heresy painting tutorial for his listeners. And from the poll results on the Discord, white was the #1 top winner by a good margin. How convenient. In that result, giving me the extra motivation to finish my studies on crafting a revised White Scars theme, one that is built for the tabletop, all while still adhering to my own tabletop standards. This tutorial is going to require both the airbrush and the brush, that includes freehand, along with some decal uses, as well as some enamel washes from AK. There is, however, no weathering or chipping going on this one. What you see here is my personal scheme for the army, and I've chosen not to do any hard scratches, dents, rust streaks, etc. This is partially to do with my own personal challenge in creating such a clean and striking army, as well as the perspective I wanted to illustrate in the 5th Legion, an unknown legionary which has taken the painting as his noble pursuit and illustrating the Ordo of Jagatai through his eyes, of beautiful, striking, and powerful warriors of his brothers to live in memory. So before we jump into the tutorial, please, if you enjoy the content, give my video a nice thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't already, as well as if you want access to over 100 plus hours of further painting tutorials, consider becoming a Patreon, where I have a lot more that cover the miniature world of the Horus Heresy, Warhammer 40k, Age of Sigmar, and much more. You also get access to my Discord, where you can link with like-minded miniature painters to discuss works, give feedback, and help each other grow as artists. Oh, and of course, while you're painting, taking public transit, or just chilling with a blunt in the evening, you should take a listen to Radio Free Isstvan and catch the best heresy podcast show out there. Much love, and let's get right into the tutorial. Alright, just as the title states, we're going to start by giving the airbrush to get our white power armor ready. Shown here are the paints that I'll be using. I did my best to actually search for the best paints that match the color that we need, so there's minimal amount of mixing. Everything through the airbrush, I'll be using AK's acrylic thinner, and at a minimum, all my airbrushing is always done with a mix at least 1:1. So 1 part paint to 1 part thinner. When we get more towards the ivory, I'll be using more thinner, so probably about 1.5 to 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint. This is to keep the paint really flow and thin, because when we're using with the airbrush, what I always like to state is that we're not going to be using this for the speed, we're doing it for the finish. And in order to get a very, very fine, nice, smooth gradient, applying the paint thin and doing multiple layers will really get us that really nice, smooth finish that we're looking for without any speckling. It's more, especially a lot more prone when we're doing, very light off-white miniatures. It's so much easier to see the speckling and a lot less forgiving than it is for darker colors. So the first color I have here is Deep Forest Skin, and I'll be using this as a base, and I'm just going to apply an even coat, a couple of coats, over a gray primer. This gray primer is from AK's 3rd generation primer, which is I quite like, and just going to put that over this coat here. As you can see, this is a really good representation of the coverage that's going to happen, and anytime I'm using the airbrush, I'm never looking for an opaque finish off the first bat. It's always going to at least take around two passes to get full coverage and to get a more opaque finish. But even then, the nature of the airbrush on how thin you can apply it with means that we get a little bit of opacity along with the thinness that we've created in the airbrush as well will help this. The reason why for that strategy is it's much easier to layer, because we can do multiple more transparent passes to get a softer fade, and where our highlight points are, we can more focus on those areas to bring a little bit more opacity and a little bit stronger coverage. Kind of like just exactly how I like to use the brush when I'm using layering techniques through the paintbrush. Is I like to play with a little bit of thinning the paint out, just so I can play with the opacity. So even just with one color range, I can get multiple values just by controlling the amount of layers that we are applying. And we could even apply the first layer wide and then start narrowing it down. The airbrush that I'm going to be using here and throughout the entire project is a Harder Steinbeck Infinity, and it's a 0.2 needle and set at roughly around 2 bars of pressure, so that's around like 28 psi. I like to fire mine a little bit higher, where if I'm going to be using airbrush glazing, I like to step that down. But I find this really helps to control the speckling, and it just requires a little bit quicker trigger control, since we're going to be applying more paint through higher pressure. We just have to be a little more softer on the touch. Now I'm going to actually get to the real highlights. I'm going to be using the dark green gray. As you can see, I'm slowly applying it onto the right side of that shoulder and then going across the backpack. The real secret here is about how much or how open you want to fire the airbrush, and what I mean by open is how far you pull the needle or you pull the trigger back to open up the airbrush. A general rule of thumb is when I'm using the airbrush is doing some test shots, which I'll show you later, is you want to find the point where it just starts to dispense paint in a soft round mark.
and that's where you want to be. That's like the sweet spot where you want to hit it. I never want to get full bore and just, apply a ton of paint at once. There's not a lot of control on there. The nice thing about getting a very, very soft mark is that all it needs to build up is a little bit more time. So just spending a little bit more time in that area will start to slowly build up the paint and build up the opacity. You combine that with running multiple passes, and you'll get a very nice soft faded and controlled look, and placing those highlights where you want to be going. In terms of the highlight placements, for these stages here, I'm always looking for upwards or outwards facing volumes. So I really like to focus, the majority of the highlights are going to be on like the shoulders, the head, the upper part of the body. And then when it gets down to the legs, I just want to be able to get more of the outwards flanged areas. So the upper thighs, of course, are facing upwards with the knees, but a lot of Space Marines are always in more of a horse stance, or a ready stance with their knees flexed. So making sure you don't get much highlight into the shins is really, really critical. On the reverse side, there's more that's facing on the rear. Since his legs are bent, we can get a little more highlight there. The next color I'm mixing into here is faded green. This is one of the critical colors that will give us a lot. And I mixed that faded green into the dark green gray around 60-40. And you can just apply it. Just put it in the airbrush because you don't have to clean it.
Hey, take care, man.
And again, I'll be starting in the right side of the shoulder pad. There's also a reason why I like to where I'm starting my airbrush application, and one of the main things is that once you're picking a volume, start in the middle and work your way out. This really helps, especially gauge a stronger aim, so you're not just hoping for the best and just blasting it, or trying to get a with maybe some full more like zenithal highlighting. You're just shooting the whole thing full bore about the top of the miniature and just okay, I'm gonna cover this. But as we start to decrease the size and making the highlights smaller, we want to be giving a little more of a conscious aim on where we're placing these lights. The other reason why I like to start in the middle, it's very similar to also freehand, is that if for whatever reason maybe the airbrush clogged a little bit, or we got the wrong color in there, maybe the value's not correct, by aiming at the center, we're always going to be painting there anyway. So even if you do make a mistake, or there's a bit of gunk in your airbrush or something, whatever goes wrong, I would say it's the mitigation of something going wrong is at minimal if we aim at the center, just because we're going to be painting more there anyway. So if a fix is just by coverage, then that's fine. Again, you can see a little more, definitely on the outsides of the legs, a little bit more, just because it's the facing is outwards, so we can get a little bit more paint on that side there. And again, I'm just making my way around the model, placing highlights, and just keep moving. The last thing you want to do is paint a lot on a single area and have the paint run. Now I clean out the airbrush and just to get rid of most of the green that's been corrupted in there. And now this mix is ivory with a bit of faded green. This is really hard to, this part was a little bit hard to film. I apologize, I tried to do my best to get the exposure correct so you guys can see the change, but also, try to get the color as correct as possible. This is what I mean by I screwed up, and especially when starting adding with the ivory, I found that it just clumps out a little bit more. Very similar to white paint. It's still smoother. I still find the AK paint smoother in that sense, but some fine adjustment that had to be made. I had to clean the tip a little bit better. But even then, like I said, if you find it's not coming out right, as long as I aimed at the center, the mistake was there, I can continue to paint. Of course, after I fix it, I could reapply my thin layers going forward and avoiding a more disastrous result. Also, I find, especially when I'm airbrushing, is it's never worth to fight it. Like if you're struggling and it's just not working, it's really easy. It can be annoying to get very frustrated at it, but sometimes you will have to empty the paint out. If you have like a metal cup or anything like that, I've done it in the past where I'll empty out the mixture into a little metal saucer pan. And so I can just save the paint. I don't feel like I'm wasting all of it, and then give it a clean and make sure it's firing correctly. To avoid those like mistakes of, a missed shot into the model itself, I should have done a test shot, but I didn't. So, you'll see how I make some of my own mistakes. But luckily, again, I was aiming at the center and I can just continue to paint. And again, I can't stress enough about the trigger control when it comes to that. It's always good to give it a shelf, like a little bit of a practice if you're not super comfortable with making these smaller shots. And again, it's just about finding that trigger balance moment where just enough paint is coming out and it's making a soft round mark at the size. And we can use that to slowly apply and slowly build up your opacity and what you want to get through there. Even better, when we're moving down to the legs, I actually don't do full coverage all the way through. I'm going to leave a lot of it semi-transparent and only gathering full opacity through a second pass on very small areas. So keeping those highlights smaller and getting a natural fade and respecting the boundaries in between each layer. It's a really good view of the leg right there. You can just see how soft it is through the airbrush, and that's ideally the type of pressure as well as the speed that we want to be applying it. And just making your way around the model. If you spend too much time in one place, commonly we'll get buildup, and then the worst case scenario, we'll get some spidering as well. Definitely not something we want. And another thing too, if you're aiming at the center of each volume when you're applying these highlights, the nice thing is if you need to make it bigger, you can always grow it. But if you're going to start wide and make it too large, you can't make it any smaller. So it just makes the corrections phase a little bit trickier. This is also, we'll get into that when we start doing some freehand, where you can start to get the idea that always start your volumes or always start your designs small and grow them out, as it's much easier to enlarge the area than it is to shrink it. And now finally I have pure ivory in the airbrush, and this one, especially with the pure ivory, this is where I really thinned it down to at least 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint, if not just a little bit more. Watch out though, if you over thin this, you just have to be very, very light on the trigger. And again, like, I'm getting fairly close and only doing small areas, really trying to keep those these highlights nice and tight, aiming especially with like their shoulder pauldrons, just aiming at like the apex of the curvature as well as the head, and the most important parts are going to be highlighted here. The only parts I hit with Ivory in this case is going to be the shoulders, the head, a little bit of the arms, and the backpack. I don't actually go much anywhere else, simply because I want a natural fade. I want my highest highlights at the top, and it starts to cascade downwards. This kind of helps just to give your Space Marines just a little more impression of height, as you know, they're like 12-foot tall superhuman warriors. So we really want to, really show off their size and just have a nice little bit of natural highlight falling downwards. It also kind of helps if you pull it off that you don't have to paint as much. And there's more actual look of what the color is. I had the footage step down in exposure just so you can kind of see the layers a little bit better. But now I've set it back up, so. Okay, I get a little bit on the legs. I decided to increase the value just a little bit more, but you can see the overall effect that the majority of the light is gathered at the top end. And there's just an example just to show you between our test dude on the left and the one that we're working on the right. Okay, so on the palette here, you can kind of see what we're doing with the red. From left to right, the reds that I use is burnt red, then blood red, dead red, and then that orangey kind of color on the right is sunny skin tone, and above that is more ivory. To start all the freehands, I'm first showing off this type of like I guess like an oriental border design. And I'm also showing this because that's the footage I have of the palette. For some reason, when I was painting the sawtooth pattern on the other the other miniature, I don't know what happened. The palette footage got lost, so this one has the palette footage attached into there. But all the designs I'm going to be starting off is with blood red. The reason why we want to start at the more vibrant red, just because we want to take advantage of our white airbrushing, and we can get a more vibrant red a lot easier by starting off with this instead of layering up from the darkest with burnt red and going upwards. You'll get a nicer vibrant color that way. The main thing to know is that when we're doing freehand, and I'll be having more tutorials on various like freehand designs throughout the White Scars, but I want to guys give you a bit of a taste, and also just to show that make it a little bit more approachable, and for any new or existing White Scars players to really give freehand a shot and give it a chance to really come out. It's simply because to me, it's really flavorful and characterful of the Legion, and it really sets your models apart and gives it that much more character. Now, when painting the freehand, a couple of things you have to keep in mind, especially when we start to paint more to try to keep these lines straight. First off is to be aware of when you're making a single paint stroke, you have to keep in mind that you're creating two edges, one edge on the left and one edge on the right. When I'm painting freehand lines, I'm generally doing my best to try to aim to make the initial line down the middle, and then I'm going to leave a little bit of room to either grow it left or grow it right. I'm not going to try to make a brush stroke that is like the equal width of this border. I'll try to keep it as thin as possible, taking my detail brush. This is with an Artist Opus 00. And once you flick down a line, then you can decide to either do an adjacent line right next to it on the left side or an adjacent line on the right. and doing your best to try to keep it as straight as possible. The nice thing about the shoulder pads, especially the Mark 6s, because they have no trim, but they also have a nice definitive edge around the entire, nice symmetrical right angle line. And what I'm trying to do is I'm using the edge of the shoulder pad as much of a guide as possible, keeping my eyes on it to make sure it is as parallel as possible. And after a single line, as you can see down here, I'll then decide how to adjust it later to make it wider. But it's always good to get the skeleton part of it down and continue going forward. To help make your lines more accurate and more straight, there's a couple things that we need to govern and we should take care of. First off is the charge in your brush. If you notice, I only ever have a small amount of paint at the tip, and I want to keep it that way. I do not need to overload my brush. You got to make sure that we're dispensing the right amount of paint and keeping the paint just thin enough so that it has a nice flow and fluidity throughout the model. I probably water this around close to I'd say like 40%, 40-60 ratio. So 40 water, 60 paint. Too thin will be a little bit more trickier to maneuver, and maybe the coverage won't be as nice, so you would have to really overlap several times going over. Remember to always, when you're loading your brush, to remove any excess. There's always marks on my thumb. That's what I'm doing. I'll pick up a little bit of paint in the palette and then remove the excess on my thumb. It's always better to have less on your brush than more. Sometimes you're gonna might go and make some paint strokes that no paint comes out, or very little. That's better than too much. Okay, just really just take your time, and even if you have to do those like ghost notes, as I call them, it's okay. The other part is about the direction of the paint stroke that I'm using. If you notice, every stroke that I'm making is always going parallel in the direction or the angle that I'm holding it at. So for your going left to right or top to bottom, you notice that the brush angle is going parallel to the direction. Don't paint like 90 degrees, like a right angle to the line. What that will do if you paint 90 degrees to the line is that you run the risk of the brush opening up too wide, and you're using like more of the belly of the brush, therefore you get an inconsistent line width. By painting in the same direction, as you can see, as I'm going upwards, you can see the brush is angled back up towards the line. That'll help keep the bristles nice and tight, and a less chance of the brush opening up unless you seriously push down and open up the bristles as you're applying the line. Now, even though through the whole design, the edges on each of these, like the 90-degree edges, may not be perfect, I'm not really worried about that right now, because we can always go back later with our ivory and use it as a rubber and cut and make any corrections through there. It's not really worth fussing about too many corrections right now. I'm still, after I got the main highlight or the main line drawing down with the blood red, now I can go in and start highlighting. The nice thing about highlighting is that after you have the line down, it's a lot less stressful because you actually have a guide to follow you through. So, placing a few highlights with some dead red are a lot less stressful than doing it completely freehand, because there's no guide for you to follow. It's only until you've completed the outline then things get a lot less stressful. Here you can see me, I'm just taking some ivory white and I'm just slowly cutting back into the design. You can start to see like little nicks, little mistakes that happen through. That's totally fine. And it just takes just a little bit of extra cleanup. I'll commonly also refer to this as a rubber. So using the background color, whatever is apparent there, as an eraser to remove excess, remove mistakes, or like, overbound paint that we've used on the red. that you can even use this if your line is way too wide. But that is all dependent on where you're at with your freehand. And a lot of it is just being a little bit like adjusting. So when I was initially painting this, once I have one width that I like on one of the lines, then I start to match everything else that way. Now I'm going to do the same thing again, but we're going to be doing the sawtooth pattern. Of course, this time there's no wet palette to show. But a real nice trick for doing the sawtooth pattern, if you want to do it freehand, is I always start in the most visible part of the pattern. So in this case, you can see that this triangle is closest to the center of the chest, so it's closest to the front and will be seen. And I'm gonna paint one triangle. You can do like equilateral triangles. I generally try to keep the angle a little bit steeper. And after you paint the first triangle, then all I'm doing is, while I'm painting the second triangle, I'm just doing my best and eyeballing the angle of the first one and trying to match it. And I know I'm not perfect. It's okay. And, and that kind of governs out how all the triangle angles are. If you were ever to look at my white scars and all the different angles that I've done, they're all different. I'm not a full machine and can just do every single pattern perfectly and at the same distance. This is also due to the fact, I think that actually just keeps a little bit more of a human touch to it. And I would always encourage any white scars player to paint some freehand on their stuff, or at least apply the decals. It's just that it just gives so much more character to the model, and you don't have to worry about making them completely perfect. Like I just said, I don't even make them perfect. Heck, when this pattern wraps around, I got a little bit lucky. I have to say that, I got several Marines in my Legion that don't have a pretty close lineup like I do right here. Some of them kind of overlap or have a half a triangle at the very end. And that's, it's just how it ends up that way. And I don't stress about it because most people are only going to see the front anyway. That's just, I guess, just a part of the process, and it really doesn't make too much of a difference. I don't think it's worth like stressing out. But what I do see is like the end result, and it really gives like the whole Legion and every single warrior is kind of like a little mini character in itself, just because, especially I guess for me, I always want to make every single Marine a little bit different. Everyone has like their own markings. And even, I have several models with this marking that's on the left shoulder pad, but, every single guy has like a little bit of a different size of the triangle. I think that just kind of, for me, it just gives it a little more of a hand-painted look, as well as like every single Legionnaire is kind of responsible maybe for decorating their own armor. And, when they add it and how they add it is totally up to them. But the highlights are pretty simple when it comes to the red, just layering up through that process of the blood red and then dead red. And then if you're going to get into some shinier parts, or some higher peak values, we can add a little bit of sunny skin tone into the mixture to give ourselves the brightest highlights. And then in the opposite direction, when we get to the darker parts, I just add some burnt red. I didn't show it in the recording here, but the other elements of the red, such as on the backpack and the hair, especially when it comes onto the backpack, those red orbs, I highly recommend taking a look at my bridge blending tutorial, because that is essentially how I created those highlights. It's just in a radial fashion rather than in a linear one that is in the tutorial. But same principle applies. Paint the entire orb with that blood red, paint in some burnt red for the shadows, and just highlight up
and bridge any values that have a higher jump in with the backpack right there. Okay, for all the black elements, the paint recipe is pretty simple. So I'm going to be using Teneberous gray mixed with some field gray, and as well you're going to need some sunny skin tone and some ivory again. So I base coated all the black areas that I want in a Teneberous gray. It's pretty much like an off black with a little like hint of purple. I quite like it. It's got a nice little bit of character to it. I'd say that's the most frustrating thing of painting this, is that when you're painting this Teneberous gray, you really don't want to hit any of that white. And it happens. I get some spots where I, kind of nick the model, and I'm like, all you got to do is rinse your brush and give it a, just get it damp and start just lightly rubbing it across the mistake to remove that paint the best as you can. And, maybe a little smudge from your finger or a Q-tip actually works really well. Just make sure that when so the paint doesn't completely dry on the white surface and we can remove it. I'm just showing you a few areas around the model which I do my black, how I paint the off black, but then we'll be mainly focusing on the gun to get the remainder of the recipe. So you can see after that Teneberous gray, I'm just giving our first stage highlights with the gray mixed with a little bit of field gray, which of course has some green in it. And the dilution here is fairly thick, so there's only just a bit of water in here, probably just like a brush load or more, like 25% thinned, not even, just to have the paint flow a little bit and just leave a little bit of a softer mark. I'm always in general in that, never painting straight from the pot. It's always with at least around like 25%, and then more commonly you'll get closer to 50%, thinned with a water to paint ratio. Sorry, ratio should be 1:1. You can see as I start highlighting this gun, I'm trying to focus the majority of the light above, hitting most of the edges and all the upwards faces edges the best I can, and almost like a little bit of overbrushing, where it's not dry brushing, so I'm not wiping all the paint off, but a little bit of overbrushing so I don't force so much paint into the recesses. If a little bit gets in there, then that's fine, it doesn't hurt. But now I'm just going to start to layer up in sequence. The gun angle, since his gun is held a little bit on an upwards trajectory, so I'm going to focus more of the highlights in towards the front of the gun. So any of those flat planes that are on the top, like that top rail and such, majority, all the highlight will be focused up towards the front of it. And not only just that, but also the some of the brush direction I'll be using. Nice thing is we're just going to be doing a simple layering up by adding a little bit more field gray and sunny skin tone to generally build up, and of course we'll also be reducing some of the sizes of highlights. At these first few stages, especially with the green, it's going to be just more of a lot coverage of the volumes themselves. But now you can start to see we can add some sunny skin tone in there. We're going to start to make that green a little bit warmer. I find like doing black like this helps with a little bit of temperature variations. You can start to see we went from cooler with the field gray mix in, and then now as we get to the higher highlights, I start adding some sunny skin tone in, and we're going to start making the gray a little bit warmer, just to have a little bit of variation and has a little bit more atmosphere.
couple that with the other, how we created our white with the green. Kind of wanted to follow suit and just have a little more harmony within the model. Especially with this highlight, you can start, you can definitely see that I'm just more favoring the upper edge highlights. I'm not going to go through every single highlight, especially that's facing downwards. It's a lot of work, especially just for guns. Something that personally I'm not like really huge on painting guns, so I always want to get it done a little bit faster. But I think this perfect amount of this overbrush just with just the layering up, I find is done pretty nice and quick without getting too technical into the blending process. There's no actual like blending stage. I am just layering up with values here. And remember, now we get to the upper highlights. I'm just putting a little bit more water, thinned it out with another extra brush load. So thinning out. Now this is more like a one-to-one paint to water ratio, and just applying the final highlights. If you notice, I'm only really focused these final highlights on the very upper parts of the gun. I'm not going through every single edge highlight. So you can kind of see like a bit of a pattern with my layering process. So the first few layers I am highlighting everything and keeping the paint a bit thicker, and as we get to the upper highlights where we start to get closer to the value of white or the desaturated brighter highlights, the paint mixture gets thinner, but also the area of the highlights are substantially getting smaller and only focusing near the top. And just adding some like little like hash scratches, almost like hash marks, as if you're like sketching, and adds a nice, easy little like fun little textured touch. The Melta Gun at the end, you could do metallics if you wanted to. Actually, for the army that I'm doing now, I've decided to do most of the metallic areas, especially on guns. I'm gonna be in metallics, but the Melta Gun was really fun to do in N&M, and it's really, really easy and fast. So the first layer is that Rhinox hide, and then with Rhinox hide, all I'm doing is mixing in more sunny skin tone and some ivory to get the highlights. Now this is a perfect example of how you can doing the layering process, but just by focusing on some brush direction, you can get a nice, easy blend without actual full-on blending back and forth, and you can work on this illusion here. So after painting down after painting this highlight here, I'm just going in a horizontal to get the highlight position. I'm then going to add these really quick vertical strokes. Now I'm going to slow this down because I was actually doing this because I felt like I was in a bit of a rush, but you can go slower. Now, do you see how I'm actually pulling? I'm starting at the top of the highlight and pulling back down into its home color. So the color that I have on the brush and where I want to place it. This quick pull down and this motion here is going to help distribute the paint, as when you lift off the brush, a little bit extra paint comes off, and I'm pulling that little puddle of paint that's happening into its home color. So the top of the stroke where it starts is just a little bit softer than where it ends, which is close to the middle. You pair this in with like these vertical strokes that are all stacked together, and you also get a bit of a ragged edge. That ragged edge, along with a little bit of a softer paint application at the tip of it, all helps in giving the illusion of the fade. So when we look at it, we can actually see there's no super hard line for our eye to follow, and that makes the like a pseudo blend a lot softer. We can add like little marks, which I unfortunately, sorry, I forgot to miss on camera, but they're just like single little paint strokes going in diagonal fashion to kind of give the the remainder of the textured look, and it kind of looks like a little bit of a, I want to make a worn down, like beaten metal metallic look that looks a little bit different from the gun. This one takes all the heat from the Melta and has the heat vents and stuff. So, and I quite like the look. I think it's nice and quick and pretty fast. I did two, so on the other side it's the same. So, doing one side, just repeating to the other. And then finally, to do the last little bit of highlight, just adding some ivory into there. And, make sure these edge highlights are really are small. I don't need to edge highlight the entire circumference of the Melta Gun. If you do that, you'll actually start to lose the effect of the N&M effect for it. It'll be a lot less shiny. So just a little bit of restraint. Yeah, some of my paint gets a little bit blobby, but again, this is just for a standard line infantryman. It's something, especially with like these cylindrical objects here, like the Melta Gun, it's a nice and easy fast win for not metallic metal. Now, as a fun little bonus thing, I didn't drill it. If you don't like drilling your bolters, but you still want to do it, you can always paint it in. But the fun thing is, it's actually like, you don't have to do this for every single model, but it's actually a really fun and easy effect to paint, and it's actually just more pleasing that when you do it, you can, it's a fun little thing to like fool yourself. So all you have to do is paint the center of where the hole is, either a black, or in this case I use the Teneberous gray again. And then I'm going to take a mid-tone of the highlight that we are using on the gun and focusing the majority of all the light on the bottom half, like a half moon, like a crescent moon, to get the outside of the barrel, outer edge of the barrel. And you can always use the blacker Teneberous gray as a rubber to correct the circular motion. And then again, with the subsequent highlights, all I'm doing is doing like a half or a third size of the bottom half of the barrel, and just bring a little bit of highlight, and then at the very end you can just make a little star, or a little light shimmer, a few lines like that, and bam, it's a really easy illusion. But it feels pretty fun. It's pleasant. Okay, now on to the pin wash. So I've got this green gray wash and blue gray wash, both by AK's Wargaming. These washes are actually really sweet, and the more and more I play with them and getting back into enamels, finding my the life is getting a little bit easier, especially for army painting. I'm just gonna take their fruit scented thinner. It smells like really cheap cologne, but I don't recommend just huffing this. The scent does make it a little more bearable, but I still wear a NIOSH mask that's approved for odor and thinners, and having a dish that has just the thinner that we will be using just for cleaning, and then our mixture in there. The mixture is like 3 parts of the dark green wash, and then just a little bit of that blue gray wash, just to lighten it up a little bit. And I want to lighten it up is because if you're just going to go in here with like a black or a dark brown wash, it's going to be really strong, and it'll be too dark of a value to get in there, and we will, it's kind of like ruin the effect that we did with this our darker green gray that we used with the highlighting of the sorry, not the highlight, but the shadows of the white. And here I'm just going to apply this pin wash in specific areas and aiming right down to the crevices of where we want to fill. I use this pin wash in substitute of lining it myself with acrylics with the brush. If this was like a character, and I'm doing like a single character, maybe like a Storm Sea or something, I would just line this all by brush with our initial mixture of like deep forest skin or like the dark green gray, and get it that way so it matches right on. But for army painting, I want to speed it up, and doing a pin wash over a gloss varnish really helps, just because we reduce the surface tension. You can see the paint, see our wash flow in there, and it's a lot more forgiving because we can use some of that I think like mineral spirit or their thinner here, just to remove or soften the marks, soften the marks that we make with this, or even just completely remove mistakes if we accidentally get way too much on the rest of the model. And if you notice, I'm really I'm aiming at specific parts because it's so easy to dirty up this white. Not like the grimdark way. Maybe it would be like lather the entire model and then you can remove it with a Q-tip. You can do that if you want, but you will dirty up that white a lot. And like I said in the introduction, I really wanted to keep like the bright and noble aspect of the Legion in display, and it's just like the style that I want to do. But regardless, if you want to make them really dirty, or like I said, if you really want to chip them up, if you were going to do like a lot of chipping and a lot of weathering, I would actually, and if you want to do the chipping with like acrylics, taking a sponge or applying hand chips and stuff, like you can always see how I do it with the Sons of Horus or the Ultramarine tutorial, and I would do that before I did the gloss varnish. So just before the pin wash, because you can get both of those in together. But for this demonstration and for this model in my army, I'm keeping them clean. A fun little thing is I just started using this brush. I got this brush from Abtalung. AK sent this to me along with their washes to have fun and play with and see how they work. But this brush they have is like a specific pin wash brush. It's super long bristles and hold a lot of wash or product within the brush, and it comes out to a nice fine tip. This should make it so you don't have to reload your brush so much, but I was still under mechanical habits of like constantly picking up more through, because I mostly used a smaller size 1 or a size 0, just because I still wanted the tip to do pin washing. But yeah, a few more times even after this tutorial using this thing, it was actually a real pleasure. Nice brush to use when you're especially if you're going to be doing a lot of pin washing, like you're going to paint a whole unit. Oh, this will make it go a lot quicker. Also, even a little tip when you're doing the gloss varnish is actually apply 2 layers, just so I get a really smooth surface doing this, because the smoother it is, it makes the pin washing a lot easier, as well as it's less prone for the enamel wash to kind of bloom. And what I mean by that is, like, if you apply this over a matte or a satin, you'll see the mark. Once you apply a mark, it'll actually, the line or whatever mark you make will kind of blossom and bloom and open up. Really good if you want to make it look really dirty. But having a really nice gloss finish will really make the wash kind of like stick closer together, so it doesn't bloom out and affect so much of the area.
Okay, so now what I'm doing here is I cleaned off the brush with the white spirit, or their scented spirit. And what I'm doing here is now I'm cleaning up as well as in the highest areas of the model. Sorry for the little lack of focus here. Really likes my fingers, you. On the main areas, especially around the head, I'd say that's the most important part, is that just by dipping a bit of thinner on the marks in the head, that will really it'll start to reduce the amount of power that the color gets, or the whole wash, enamel wash, gets stained. Because I really want really shallow marks. I don't want anything super strong, because again, if the mark is too strong, or using a really dark liner, I find it's like way too harsh, and we kind of lose you'll lose the softness of the white, and the contrast will be a little too strong and stark. Not something of not something of the effect that I want to get. But just going around the mall here, and anytime I see a little bit of like the enamel wash kind of blooming and going past its borders, that's when I can just use a little bit of enamel thinner that's not like soaking in the model, but a little bit damp. I kind of just always just wipe a little bit off of my kitchen towel. Sorry, that's off camera. But after I, give it a quick swish in the thinner, I just give a dab off on a paper towel, just so it's not soaking there. Okay, and finally, this is probably my favorite part of the entire painting. I just love doing like max highlights. I find them really rewarding. Now, there's a bonus on top of a bonus. So the first bonus is just getting Ivory. We're going to thin this paint out 2 to 3 parts water to 1 part paint. We got to keep it thin. As well as a secondary mix for the bonus highlight is Ivory, just with a pinch of Sunny Skin Tone. If you notice, Sunny Skin Tone has made it into this model quite a bit. And the reason for that is, if all my highlights have a little bit of that's contained in it, that kind of sets the temperature of the light that's being hit on the model, and kind of gives a little bit of a unified look across all the highlights on the model. But starting with the Ivory, again, this mixture is at least 2 parts water to 1 part paint. We can get close to 3, especially when you start doing the highlights. You're going to see that in a second. The edge highlights are the easier ones to pick out, and I'm only going to focus the edge highlights on the upper parts of the model. I'm not going to bother doing all the edge highlights everywhere on the lower legs and everything. Just to bring further attention from our airbrushing, remember how our pure Ivory was at the top of the model, so we're just going to stick up there and do those. So helmet to me is always the most important, so taking a little bit more time and doing all the edge highlights on the helmet here. I'll bust out the 00 brush and make my way around them nice and soft. Again, it's really, getting these soft touches is really about watching the charge on your brush. You can notice I do not have a lot of paint on the brush, and there's not a lot of paint coming on the model, so you do not need a ton of paint in there. And we use similar tricks like we did with the directional brush that we were using, that I was showing on the Melta Gun. Always pulling your paint back into its home color, so where naturally we want our highlight to be generated. Really helps and goes a long way of getting a natural nice little fade. So here on the beak, it is pretty much a cone, so I'm going to have that highlight run down the ridge, central ridge of the helmet, and then along the edges I'm always pulling up towards the main highlight. And that's just with, we're pairing this paint that's like 2 to 3 parts water to 1 part paint. It's pretty thin. We get a very soft mark on the outer edge and a little bit of extra paint that we gathered right at the apex of the highlight, and therefore the most coverage happens there, so we get a nice little fade. And that's like, just with highlighting, when you're highlighting on top of light colors, or we can also, do some shading, is really thin this paint out. It's almost like we're operating with thick glazes now, where this is actually kind of like a form of a glaze if you really want to be technical. But, keeping your paint thin and slowly, staining the areas. This is where I only really do the highlights on the upper end here. For larger areas, such as large round areas, I initially start by stippling the shape into position. Very similar to like freehand, where I start in the middle and grow the size that I want it to be. Don't start on the outside or the outside of the circle and try to draw it, because if you make it too big, well, you can't make it smaller. But starting off small, we can also make it larger. So after the stipples, now this paint, I've changed the consistency to like 4:1, so 4 parts water, 1 part paint. And again, look at the brush direction that I'm pulling. I'm always pulling into the center. This gets a nice natural drag and makes the outer brush strokes soft, while it keeps it allows the finishing part of the pigment to sit in the center. And that's how I will approach all of the rounded highlights. So all the rounded stuff from like probably mainly on the shoulder pads, just a bit of stippling to get the center part of the highlight filled, and then using that glaze mixture, that like 4:1, just starting from the outside of it and pulling up into the center. Here I'm just making the highlight on the the front of the helmet just a little bit bigger by, again, the same glaze at 4:1, 4 parts water to 1 part paint. And to top it off, this is the bonus land, is I'm just doing a few stippling dots at the the apex of of each highlight with this ivory and sunny skin tone, just to give a little bit of color at the max highlight. In all honesty, I don't think I'll be doing this for all of the army. Or if anything, it'll just be on the head, because, depending how much detail you want to put on your tabletop miniatures, totally up to you. But again, like I said, like, I love to get carried away in this stage. I love doing these like final highlights, and it just really makes that little extra detail and really helps it pop. But don't feel that you're like losing if you don't do this stage. And finally, for the eyes, all I'm doing for the eyes here is I took, I think it was Japanese uniform. Yeah, I think it's Japanese uniform, and I'm just painting the eyes in there. No fancy like glowing OSL eyes or anything. Actually, it looked really terrible since so much of the armor is white. It's really hard to get a darker value around the eyes dark enough so that the glow actually comes out proper. So I just opt for a flatter yellow eye, which I think, golden yellow, I think it complements the white scars really, really well. What I should have done actually is started off with Dubai brown or like Rhinox hide, just to get the darker lining around the lens to give just a little bit definition in there. I do it later, but yeah, doing it this way is more work. But for some reason, I don't know what I was thinking when I was painting this. I was like, yeah, I'm just gonna do it. I'm like, oh, there's not enough separation. So I actually had to go back and paint in the lining between the eyes. But
I just still wanted to keep this in because, gotta paint those eyes and finish off the lenses. I paint them pretty simply. I don't spend too much time on them, especially if they're like, for like infantry models. I need them to look good at a certain distance. And I just want to get the yellow in there. So after with Japanese uniform, all I'm just doing is adding an ivory to the mixture just to get higher values. And just give it a little bit layer up. So here's the Dubai brown, which I should have started with. I should have actually painted the entire eye Dubai brown. Take a little bit of ivory to paint the inner part of the lens, just leaving an outline of Dubai brown. That ivory just helps so that the Japanese uniform just has a little more punch to come off from, and then layer up as normal to get the eye lens. And as we finish up the eyes, that's going to be all for the White Scars tutorial. Thanks again for all you guys watching, as well as to all the listeners and of RFI, Radio Free Isstvan. Not only for voting on the Legion that you wanted to see, or the color that you guys wanted to see how to paint, but also really motivated me to finalize this tutorial and really finalize the paint scheme that I need for my own White Scars army. And really fun to share the process with you guys. If you really like this tutorial and you want to see more, please consider subscribing to my Patreon, especially with a lot more White Scars coming about, mainly how to paint their characters, so showing a little more in-depth brush work on how to do the various elements and illustrate more white and more detail, as well as the vehicles. And don't forget the tiny scale. There's going to be more White Scars, so more things coming from Legions Imperialis coming really soon. Hopefully GW gets on their butt and gets that reprint of the book so they can release it. Give me a date so I can finally show you guys more tutorials and more things going on with that game that's coming out soon. As well as, with all the other models and the miniatures I love to paint, everything ranging from like Age of Sigmar, Warhammer 40k, more Horus Heresy and all of its other affiliate games, and even some model ranges outside Games Workshop. Other than that, thanks again for joining me on this tutorial, and we will catch you in the next one. Happy painting!